Hi, and welcome to this video which provides anti-terrorism level 1 training for the South Carolina State Guard personnel, also known as AT1. My name is Matthew Phillips with the Critical Infrastructure Protection Unit of the Provost Marshal Detachment. I will be delivering this training specified by the DoD, but relating it to our mission here in the State Guard. After viewing this video in its entirety, you will have completed the AT1 training, but you will need to email me to confirm your completion. Details will follow at the end of the presentation. Anti-terrorism level 1 training was created by the DoD for the safety and security of all DoD personnel. We are required to go through this training as part of our service in the South Carolina State Guard. The DoD also created this slide deck to go with the training, and I'll be adapting it to our State Guard mission as much as possible. We'll start the training by going over your responsibility. For anti-terrorism awareness, it is your responsibility to be the scout or the sentry. That is to say that it is your responsibility to understand the signs of possible terrorism, to be able to observe your surroundings for things that are out of place, to protect yourself, and the DoD wants you to go through the training to understand how to survive a hostage situation in the very unlikely event that that should present itself. It's important to understand who is the target. Just by the fact that you have put on this uniform, you have made yourself a target. In today's political climate, we can certainly understand that law enforcement, military, or other government personnel can be targeted by terrorists or other violent actors. Throughout the rest of this presentation, you will see the word terrorist pop up a number of times. And while we can have a good debate about how to define the term terrorism or terrorist, we can think of it in a more broad sense to think about extremists or other violent actors. The threat that will be dictated for your personal duty station will be different depending on where you're going to serve. Whether you're going to 1st Civil Service Brigade, Professional Services Command, or anywhere else in the State Guard, every duty location is going to have a different threat. And it is up to you to determine that threat as soon as possible. Work with your S2, work with your chain of command to understand what you need to be aware of where you're going to be serving. The next set of the training goes over IPMs, or Individual Protective Measures. These individual protective measures are going to be applicable to your service in the State Guard, but they're equally applicable to your personal and professional lives. We'll start with some basics on safety when traveling and staying in hotels. As part of your membership here in the State Guard, you may be conducting travel for your service. There may be the opportunity to stay in base hotels. If not, try to use hotels that have major brands, Marriott's and Hilton's and so forth. These major brands are going to have the security resources and physical presence that is going to deter attacks. This is also true in the international environment. Try to stay to the major Western brands. Try to be careful when entering and exiting rooms, halls, lobbies, and public areas. Essentially, you need to be aware that there are physical constraints in the building that are going to dictate different security concerns. Whether that's unseen corners, whether that's the positions for overwatch, or other security concerns, you need to be aware of how the physical environment is going to dictate what the security threats are that you might face. Know the locations of emergency exits and emergency equipment. This would include things like fire extinguishers, staircases, emergency escapes, or even AEDs. Understand where these things are. Most hotels are going to have maps for every floor and every hotel room that list the location of emergency exits and other emergency equipment. If you are not expecting any deliveries, refuse them should they arrive. Try to use the taxis that are part of the reputable taxi service in the area that you're staying. A good rule of thumb is to use the taxis that look like all of the other taxis. Finally, report any suspicious, unusual activity. You can report this to hotel security or local law enforcement. A final tip on hotels is think carefully about which hotel room you are requesting. I would recommend trying to stay somewhere on the 2nd or the 3rd floor of the hotel. This is because in the event of a fire, most fire truck ladders cannot reach above the 3rd floor, and in the event of an on-street shooting, bullets are not going to breach above the 1st floor. Staying on the 2nd or the 3rd floor is one of the safest floors statistically to stay in a hotel. When you are traveling, particularly if you are traveling internationally, carefully plan your route, your alternate route, and itinerary. If you've never been somewhere before, try to get a detailed briefing of the city that you're planning to visit. You can work with the Department of State to understand what you need to know about where you're going. You can even register your service with the local embassy. Avoid traveling alone if you can, and make an emergency contact list to take with you. This doesn't have to be anything major. Just write down the names and the numbers of people on an index card or a business card to keep in your pocket should you lose your phone or other technological means of contacting people. Certainly we don't deal with classified information here in the State Guard, but you may be privy to sensitive information related to State Guard operations or other forms of identifiable information. Don't leave this information in an unattended vehicle, and don't leave this information in an unattended hotel room either. Keep your supervisor, your chain of command, informed about your whereabouts, and as usual, report your suspicious and unusual activity that you see to chain of command or local law enforcement if necessary. When traveling on airlines, think about your safety in the context of the routes with the high-risk areas. Don't try to fly routes that have stops in high-risk areas, and this is particularly in the international realm. Avoid delays in unsecure areas of the airport when possible, and this is going to look different in different areas of the world. In the United States, unsecure areas might mean on the other side of security before people have been screened, but that might be different in different areas or different countries. It might mean the bathrooms. It might mean areas where there are not a lot of other people. If you're seeing a suspicious or unusual activity, report it to airport security or law enforcement. Think about how much conversation you're having with other passengers. Limit that conversation to the extent that you can. Certainly you can be friendly, you can be cordial, but the other passengers might not need to know your life story. They certainly might not need to know about your service with the South Carolina State Guard. Even if the person that you're talking with seems perfectly honest and trustworthy, that doesn't mean that the other passengers around you aren't also listening in. Avoid long layovers if you can, and do not fly in uniform. You do not want to present yourself as a target. In flight, it is recommended that you sit in the middle rear portion of the airplane, somewhere around the blue seats that are located. Statistically, these are the seats with the highest rates of survivability in the event of a crash. Although skyjacking has become a much more rare event in the modern era, it is still a threat to some degree in the international environment. The DoD wants you to be aware of the indications of skyjacking. The first indications of a skyjacking are probably going to occur sometime in the first 15 to 60 minutes of the flight. The plane has gotten off the ground. They may or may not have reached cruising altitude, but they haven't gotten far enough down the flight path that they couldn't be diverted to some other destination if a skyjacker were to gain control of that aircraft. In the event that someone is trying to breach the cockpit, pilots are trained to prevent this, so the ride's going to get a little bit bumpy. Please fasten your seatbelt if you see any indication of this skyjacking. Hide any military-related documents that you have. This might include your State Guard ID or any State Guard documents you have with you. And if you were demanded to show identification, show your civilian identification. This part of the presentation is a quiz, going over some basics about travel and travel security. I'm certainly not going to sit here and wait for an answer, but hopefully by this point you can pause the video and think about the answers for yourself. The next module goes over the ability to detect surveillance. Surveillance is understood to be the secretive, continuous, and sometimes periodic watching of persons, places, vehicles, or objects in order to obtain information. When you are trying to be aware of surveillance or items that may be surveilled or watched, even stalking, do not assume that the persons who are conducting this surveillance are always behind you, and do not assume that they are always men. This is one of those situations in the presentation where the word terrorist is used, but we can apply a more broad sense of violent actors or extremists. These violent actors and extremists can be anyone, anywhere. If you are trying to determine whether or not you are being surveilled or followed, here's what to look for. Look for multiple sightings of the same suspicious person, vehicle, or activity, and those suspicious sightings are separated by time, distance, and location. That is, you're seeing the same person or the same vehicle or the same activity at different places, at different times, and at different locations. You're looking for individuals who stay at buses or train stops for extended periods of time when buses or trains come and go. In other words, if a person is sitting in an area of public transportation and they're not using the public transportation, that may be an indication that they are surveilling something or someone. Similarly, you can look for individuals who are ordering food at restaurants, but they leave before the food arrives, or they're ordering without eating. Looking for individuals who are drawing pictures, taking notes in areas that are not normally of interest to tourists. Persons who are photographing security cameras or guard locations. joggers who are standing and stretching for an inordinate amount of time. Any of these may be indicators that someone may be conducting surveillance. Essentially, you're looking for the wool coat at the pool party. You're looking for individuals who don't fit the surrounding environment. If you believe that you are being surveilled, you can conduct any number of passive maneuvers in order to confirm this. The goal of passive maneuvers is not to draw attention to yourself, but just to confirm that you are under surveillance. When conducting these passive maneuvers, the idea is to be subtle. If you conduct a series of these maneuvers and you believe that you are under surveillance, it's perfectly appropriate to report those suspicions to authorities, including your chain of command and local law enforcement. If you are on foot, some passive maneuvers to determine whether or not you're under surveillance would include things like turning around, retracing your route, pretending like you forgot something, seeing if somebody follows you. Using your mirror or windows for reflections. Certain in the urban environment, there are any number of reflective surfaces that can be used to determine what's behind you without the more obvious action of turning and looking over your shoulder. Try to use unexpected stops. Go places you don't normally go. Speed up, slow down to see if somebody is changing their pace to match yours. And if you need to, try the sudden use of a taxi or bus. Getting into a taxi or bus abruptly and then trying to see if somebody else tries to do the same thing so that they can match where you're going. Any of these may be indicators that you are being surveilled or followed. There are parallel sets of passive maneuvers that you can conduct to determine whether or not you're being surveilled or followed while you're driving. These would include changing or varying your speed, speeding up, slowing down, seeing if somebody is varying their speed to stay with you, signaling for a turn but then missing that turn, conducting a U-turn, circling the block, for example, making a series of 4 right turns to come back to the same spot you started from, and using traffic controls to your advantage, things like yield signs or yellow lights, trying to determine if somebody else is taking undue risk to stay with you when they otherwise shouldn't. If you have been conducting passive maneuvers and you believe that you are under surveillance or are being followed, and you believe you are in a life-threatening situation, you can conduct a greater degree of maneuvers to evade or escape that level of surveillance or being followed. Certainly you need to know the safe areas. This goes back to the idea that you need to get the briefing of the city that you're going to before you go there. Alerting local law enforcement is always a good idea. Head to high-density areas. Go to areas where there are a lot of crowds. Deviating your route. Change your appearance if you can. So, for example, if you're wearing a hat, take it off. If you have a hat on you but you're not wearing it, put it on. Swap your glasses. Change your coat. If you can move a bag from one shoulder to the other or take off the bag entirely. Things like this to change your appearance after you've broken line of sight would be a good way of trying to escape that surveillance. Another option is after breaking line of sight, do a 90-degree turn and hide. So at the corner of a building, you can break line of sight and then try to hide to see if somebody follows you. And if necessary, jump in a taxi to try to get away from the situation. If you believe that you are being surveilled or followed, you should report this information to your chain of command, your S2, to the civilian and military law enforcement as soon as possible. Another quiz is here. You can pause the video if you like to make sure that you understand the answers to each of these questions. The next module goes over principles of hostage survival in the very unlikely event that this situation should present itself. First, you should understand what hostages are. Hostages represent human bargaining chips. Persons take hostages because they believe they can trade human life for whatever it is that they are demanding. Should you find yourself in this unlikely scenario, you should understand that being a hostage, or that as a hostage, your conduct and your behavior can either enhance or diminish your chances of survival. There are multiple hostage strategies that you can take in order to enhance your chances of survival. These would include trying to determine the sensitivity of your captors. Understand what angers them, what are their demands, and what are the issues that have caused them to take hostages in the first place. If you can determine those sensitivities, try to avoid things that anger or aggravate those sensitivities. Be an active listener. Do not offer advice, do not ask questions, but try to determine again what is going on and trying to understand what are the needs and the wants of your captors. There's a difference between adaptation and adoption. As a hostage, you may need to adapt your behavior in order to enhance your survivability, but do not adopt the behaviors of your captors. Avoid making any kind of improper description, particularly as it relates to a hostage taker's religion. Do not pretend that you are an expert in their demands or their culture. And try to establish rapport with your captors. You can establish rapport by making eye contact, by engaging in casual conversation, commenting on photos that you see, and generally accepting their culture to include their language, their food, and their cultural idiosyncrasies. Essentially, you are trying to establish a human connection. To improve your survival odds, remain calm at all times. Try to control your instinctive behavior to fight or flee. Follow the instructions of your captors. Try to create a non-threatening image, and avoid personal injury to yourself while you are being held captive in the event that you need to facilitate your own escape. During a hostage scenario, Stockholm Syndrome is a persistent threat. Stockholm Syndrome is an automatic subconscious emotional response to the trauma of becoming a victim. It is named for a psychological manifestation from a bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden, in which bank robbers held a number of persons hostage. During the hostage scenario, these individuals became sympathetically connected with their captors, refused to testify after being released, and started adopting the behavior of their captors. Although this was not the first time that this behavior had been witnessed in history, it was the first time it was given a name. The point is that Stockholm Syndrome is not particularly well understood so that anyone can be a victim. We don't know what are the psychological mechanisms that make one individual more prone to Stockholm Syndrome or other individuals less prone to Stockholm Syndrome. Stockholm Syndrome classically moves through 3 sequences of events. These include denial, regression, and identification. Denial is the phenomenon of, this isn't happening to me. The idea that you are denying the situation that you're in. Regression occurs when a person Regression occurs when a person stops providing for their own needs and starts relying on their captors for their needs. Finally, identification is when a hostage starts identifying with, empathizing with, and adopting the behavior of their captors. Should an individual start to manifest Stockholm Syndrome, this may produce empathy, participation with the events or the actions of their captors, losing touch with reality, trying to impede their own rescue or negotiation efforts. It may produce long-term emotional instability and can be a violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The DoD wants its personnel to understand these premises so that should you find yourself in the very unlikely scenario of a hostage situation, you can survive with honor. Here we have one more quiz. Pause the video if you need to make sure that you understand the answers to these questions. The next module goes over active shooter situations. Active shooters are defined to be one or more subjects who participate in a random or systematic shooting spree, demonstrating his or their intent to continuously harm others, and who continues to do so even in the presence of responding officers. As part of your South Carolina State Guard training, you should be completing a FEMA course on the active shooter. That module will go into much more detail about active shooter situations. This training provides simply basics of these situations. Studies of previous active shooters have led to the idea that there are several indicators that may be present before an attack occurs. That is to say that noticing these kinds of indicators may be able to identify who could become an active shooter before they start making violent activity. These indicators would include things like making anti-American statements, being aggressive or making threats, possessing or bragging about the possession of unauthorized weapons, communicating with U.S. enemies or adversaries, making allegations of U.S. persecution or prejudice, experiencing abnormal mood swings, experiencing flashbacks to traumatic events, or undergoing domestic and financial problems. Any one of these on its own may not indicate an active shooter. However, if you start noticing multiple of these scenarios, that may be a good indicator or a red flag of potentially violent activity in the future. If you notice any of these behaviors, contact your supervisor or your chain of command. If you perceive that there is an immediate threat, alert security or local law enforcement. Should you find yourself in an active shooter situation, there are multiple responses you could take. Responses to an active shooter could include evacuating, sheltering in place, or taking action against the active shooter. And this parallels with the run, hide, fight paradigm now put out in public service announcements. Should you find yourself in an active shooter situation, you should know the basic fundamentals. If you are in an exposed position, try to seek cover in a place that can be sealed off or barricaded, and understand the difference between cover and concealment. Cover is going to stop bullets, whereas concealment is simply going to hide you from visual identification. If you are in an active shooter situation, evacuate if you possibly can. If necessary, be prepared to shelter in place. And as a last resort, you may need to take action against the shooter. This is a risky scenario, but it may be your best chance for survival. If you have to do this, commit to your actions and recruit others to help you if possible. When first responders arrive on the scene, cooperate with their orders and do not be a distraction. Understand that first responders, when they are arriving on an active shooter situation, they are not there to deal with your concerns. They are there to stop the threat. Here we have another active shooter quiz. I'm not going to wait for the answers, but hopefully you can figure these out for yourselves. So the first question, knowing indicators of an unstable person can allow you to identify an active shooter before an incident. This is true. Active resistance should be the immediate response to an active shooter incident. This is false. Between running, hiding, and fighting, you should do whichever one of those is the most probable to guarantee your survival in that scenario. If you can evacuate, do so. Which of the following is not an early indicator of a potential active shooter? The correct answer is number 4, a reasonable disagreement with U.S. government policy. The final module of this training concerns personal identifiable information, or PII. PII, personally identifiable information, is any information which can be used to distinguish or trace an individual's identity. It includes any personal information which is linked or linkable to a specific individual. It might include hard copy or electronic records stored within databases or other applications. These could be stored on computers, laptops, cell phones, and it certainly includes anything in the realm of social media today. Examples of breaches of personally identifiable information are many. They could include lost or stolen mobile computing devices like laptops or cell phones. It could include the posting of PII on public-facing websites. It might include successful network intrusions or hacking. But generally they include any time that someone gains access to PII without the official need to know. This might be on interagency websites or bulletin boards. It might be through distributing PII in hard copy or electronic form, or the improper disposal of PII. So for example, throwing out sensitive information into the garbage rather than putting it through a shredder. It's important to take a minute to think about the level of PII that is being posted to social media. Although that is not part of the specific training put forth by DoD, I do want you to be concerned about what kinds of social media information you are putting out, specifically as it relates to the South Carolina State Guard. My best rule of thumb is if you don't want everybody else in the world to know about it, don't post it on social media. This includes anything related to South Carolina State Guard operations or activities. If you have something about the South Carolina State Guard that you'd like to post on your personal social media account, work with public affairs before you do this. It's important to safeguard PII because unauthorized recipients of PII may fraudulently use that information, for example, to conduct identity theft. It's important to safeguard it because damage to the victim can affect good name, credit, job opportunities, and could result in criminal charges or arrests depending on the nature of the breach. The resolution of a PII breach is costly and time-consuming, and as an employee of the South Carolina State Guard, you could suffer criminal or civil charges and penalties for failure to protect PII. I will again make the plea that you very carefully consider any information that you have related to South Carolina State Guard or State Guard operations. This would include orders. This would include your South Carolina State Guard email, your ID, and even your uniform. Protect all of this information. Unscrupulous actors could use any of this information to try to access South Carolina State Guard activities, events, or information for the intent to do harm. Contact your privacy coordinator or supervisor as soon as you suspect you have an actual loss or compromise of personally identifiable information. Report this information to your supervisor or your chain of command as quickly as possible. Again, this would include the loss of any PII, including State Guard orders, breaches of your email, loss of your State Guard ID, equipment, or even your uniform. The quicker that you can report this information, the quicker the State Guard can take action to prevent any serious breach or damage of State Guard operations. If you believe that your personally identifiable information has been breached in terms of your own information not related to the State Guard, so for example your financial information, please monitor your financial accounts for any suspicious activity. Get in touch with your bank and your credit card agencies to understand the proper actions. This concludes AT1 training. In this training, we've gone over individual protection measures to include travel, hotels, and airline. We've gone over the ability to detect surveillance. We've gone over active shooter training, breaches of PII, and hostage scenarios. Hopefully by this point you have better information on how to protect yourself and how to protect those around you serving here in the South Carolina State Guard. Now that you have completed this training, in order to receive credit, you need to send me an email at the information or at the address that's on your screen. Please reference AT1 training in that email so that we can get you your certificate of completion. And should you have any questions about this training or would like to discuss this information further, you are also welcome to email me at the address on your screen. Thank you very much for going through this training. I wish you all luck and I thank you for your service to the South Carolina State Guard.